Hi, Gabor.
Hi, Bob. Nice to be with you.
Good to be with you. Thanks for taking the time. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. You're a Gabor Maté, actually. Probably a commonly mispronounced name, I would think. Don't a lot of people say Maté, and it's really Maté?
Actually, people most often mispronounce my first name. They call it Gabor rather than Gabor.
Well, that's thanks to Eva and Jaja, right?
That's thanks to them, yeah. Fellow Hungarians.
Yeah. But anyway, I think I now have it 100% correct. Gabor Maté.
Yeah.
And you're a very well-known physician and writer, known for writing about physical health, mental health, the connections between the two. Some years back, I think, gained a lot of prominence as an expert on addiction, wrote a book called In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts about that. But the book we're going to be talking about today is your new one. It's called The Myth of Normal: Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. It's a collaboration with your son, Daniel, who also did the narration on the audio. He did a very good job, I got to say. He may have a second calling there. Must be very gratifying to have a book that's not only a New York Times bestseller, but a collaboration with one of your children, right?
It is. I'm a accomplished writer myself, but I really couldn't have written this book without Daniel's help. It's just a big topic, and it needed lightening up, and it needed a different perspective sometimes. So it was a real pleasurable, sometimes difficult, but ultimately very satisfying collaboration.
Most good collaborations are difficult in my experience, and I would imagine that being related to the collaborator doesn't make things easier. So let's talk about the book. Some books have titles that almost demand that the first question in a conversation with an author be to elaborate on the title. So I'm going to do that. What is the? I'm going to ask that question. What are our misunderstandings about the normal? What do you mean when you say the myth of normal?
Well, the biggest misunderstanding is that we confuse normal with healthy and natural. Now, that confusion is pardonable. As a physician, I will talk about a normal range of temperature or a normal range of body chemistry, or a normal range of blood pressures within which human life is possible, outside of which it is threatened. So normal equates to healthy and natural. However, we then transpose that to the rest of our lives. I mean, we also think that what we're used to, what is normal, what is the norm, is also healthy and natural. I'm arguing that what is normal in this culture is neither healthy nor natural. In fact, I think it's toxic for people. So what is normal here is the very opposite of healthy and natural.
Okay. And yeah, that's one thing that's interesting about the book is you're tracing our troubles both to the culture that we find ourselves in, as adults maybe, but also often to experiences in our past. That's where the trauma comes in, and the subtitle is Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. Want to hold up the book, by the way, if you have a copy. It's
Sure.
very...
I happen to have one.
You happen to have one. What a coincidence.
Yeah.
The Myth of Normal. Bright. I like it. So I think we should maybe start by talking about trauma. That's also an important part of your analysis of addiction, I gather. And you've done a lot of work on trauma. And maybe we could start by putting it in the context of your own childhood.
Sure.
In general, the book is very you're very good about self-disclosure. You're very candid about yourself. Sometimes you're hard on yourself. You talk about ways that maybe you could have been a better parent and so on.
Wait a minute. Where am I being hard on myself? I'm just describing the way it was. I'm not being hard on myself.
Exactly. I know what you mean. You describe your situation in ways that might commonly be interpreted as being hard on yourself because you point to things, maybe you say things like, maybe there are things you could have done differently as a parent. There are ways in which I mean, there's an episode I want to talk about where a bunch of shamans in South America tell you, like, you're just like, you're too grim, man, too much negative energy. I want to talk about all that. But that's what I mean. I take your point that it's not, I mean, what you're making is a distinction between being honest with yourself about your past and your present and your nature and everything, and blaming yourself and being like down on yourself. And you don't recommend blaming yourself and being down on yourself.
No, I don't. I used to, but I don't. Look, as a parent, I passed on my trauma to my kids. We just do that. That's what we do. That's not the same as blame. That's just saying that's how it is, and it's taking responsibility. I did my best when I was a parent, and that happened to be my best. And that best was constrained by, as you suggest, my own early experiences. And, I mean, you've written a book about Buddhism. The Buddha abandoned his child and his wife, for God's sakes. Now, there's no way that would have, at least in the short, I know in the long term they're reconciled and he brought them into the fold, but I would think neither the wife nor the infant would have been too pleased by being abandoned. And the Buddha himself, as your fellow Buddhist Mark Epstein, the psychiatrist, points out in his book, The Trauma of Everyday Life, the Buddha himself was traumatized because his mother died when he was a week old,
Okay.
And so then he leaves his child, and this is multi-generational trauma being passed on,
Right.
and we just do that. But if you understand the sources of it, there's no room for blame. It's just how it happens. And so, I mean, no way do I consider I'm being myself. I'm beating myself up. I mean, in no way do I consider that I'm being hard on myself when I disclose stuff in my life where I don't necessarily show up as a hero,
Mm-hmm.
And whether that's in relation to my children or to my wife or even to my work. Fact is, there's stuff there that was driven by unconscious forces, which made me behave in ways that weren't particularly good,
Mm-hmm.
or I should say, healthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is, and I mean, speaking of that and like blaming people and things, before we get back to trauma, let's kind of jump to the cultural critique part of the book.
Yeah.
I think you'd agree that your perspective is left of center. You're not a big fan of every effect that capitalism has had on the world. It's safe to say. There are some politicians whose behavior you don't applaud. There's a lot about the current culture that you don't think is healthy, but you take pains not to, in a sense, not to blame the politicians, the capitalists, whoever, whom some on the left really would be very hard on, right? Because you see them all as victims. You see, and which leads to a kind of a tension that you are, I guess, challenging us to reconcile. That on the one, there's a sense in which we're all victims, but you don't think it's healthy for us to think of ourselves fundamentally as victims. Is that right?
No, it's not helpful, because that's then to see myself as a victim is to identify with my suffering and to say I am my suffering. But nobody is their suffering. Everybody's more than that. And as far as politicians and capitalists, well, look, I simply point out that that's hardly new information, that food corporations conspire to create addictive products to hook people into sugar, salt, and fat, which is unhealthy for them and kills them, but they don't give a damn because they want to make money. I just point that out. It's just a reality. It's, you can say blaming or not blaming, it's just how it is. I can point out that corporations conspire to keep news about climate change that their own scientists had discovered decades ago, but they've kept that information from the public. In fact, they tried publicly to discredit the very science that their own researchers have identified. I just point that out. I point out that the drug companies have knowingly manufactured opiates and advertised them to physicians as less addictive than other opiates, and that has caused a lot of deaths.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know what's being left of center about that. I'm just stating reality, Now, it's only left of center in a society that is tilted towards the corporate view, and you're not supposed to talk about these things. I'm hardly the first one, but even this distinction left of center, I mean, I'll own to my own political views and my perspectives, and I do nothing to hide them. But even that designation left of center assumes that there's a kind of a center, and then you can be to the right of it, to the left of it. But that center in this society is skewed towards the mainstream corporate view of things. And they also happen to be the one who own news corporations and television networks. Am I creating that reality, or is that reality? So what does it even mean, left of center, except in a certain context?
Mm-hmm.
And like the Buddha said, everything is created in the mind, everything is thought in the lead. So as soon as you identify me as left of center, now you're pigeonholing me in a certain area that's defined by this society, and people immediately have emotional reactions to that based on their own perceptions. Those emotional reactions are either positive or negative, but forget the designation. Let's just talk about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. That's what I would.
Okay. My point on the your attitude toward politicians, capitalists, and anyone else whose behavior you may think is in some sense unfortunate, is that
including my own,
including your own, is that there's a reason for it. It's like, and that's what I meant by not blaming him and saying there's a sense in which they are victims, even though you don't think it's necessarily healthy for us to think of ourselves as victims. There's a reason for the way people are. You tend to locate trauma, childhood trauma, as the source of a lot of this, right? I mean, even for the rapacious capitalist, whoever, you think that's often what's going on?
Well, I think here's where the look, any system will create personalities and the values and promote behaviors that serve its survival. That's just a function of any system.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the plot or the conspiracy of any one particular group of people. That's just how the system works. In that system, now, if you have a system whose essential self-identified value is profit, then you're going to get people at the top whose interest is profit, regardless of the impact of human life and human health. That's just how it is.
Okay.
Now, people who will then rise to success in that system very often have to ignore their own humanity, at least in their work lives. Who would do that? Somebody who's shut down from their own humanity owing to childhood experience. So the needs of the system and childhood experiences work together to create some kind of personalities. As far as victimhood, look, I could talk to you about Hitler's childhood. He was a terribly abused child, terribly abused. But does anybody look upon Hitler as a victim? Forget this idea of victimhood. I don't deal in those terms. I just look at, here's what happens. Here are the factors that shape human life. Here are the factors that shape human psychology and human behavior. Let's look at them. Let's understand them. And let's create conditions in which more nourishing and more healthy dynamics are the rule. That's my only interest here.
Okay. Now, speaking of Hitler, I think one way to get at what you mean by trauma and start exploring that concept is to talk about your own childhood.
Sure.
So why don't you do that? Now, you were born in Germany, and then your parents very, very quickly went to Budapest, or you were born in Hungary?
No, we're Hungarians. I was born in Hungary, and Hungary was an ally of Germany in the Second War. And I was born in January 1944. And by that time, the Germans had largely exterminated the Jewish population in the neighboring countries. Czechoslovakia, in Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and so on. But Hungary being an ally of Germany, Germany didn't occupy Hungary until until March of 1944, which is when the Hungarian government began to think about that maybe this war is not going very well. Maybe we want to leave the German alliance. And at which point the Germans said, no, you don't. And they occupied Hungary. I was 2 months of age at the time. And so then I spent the first year of my life till the end of January 45 as a Jewish infant under Nazi occupation. And in the 3 months between March and June of 44, the Germans managed to exterminate 500,000 Hungarian Jews, including my grandparents. And my mother and I, living in Budapest, they had not got to emptying Budapest of its Jews yet. So we survived. And then in June of 44, the German deportation stopped because of international pressure, actually. And so then my mother and I continued to live in Budapest. But then in October of that year, far right-wing, fascist, incredibly anti-Semitic, violent, dark-minded party took over the power, and at which point the suffering of the Jews was redoubled or quadrupled. More killings started, and so on. That was my first year of life, and my mother had to look after me under those conditions with food deprivation, constant threat of death or deportation, grieving her parents' death in Auschwitz, not knowing whether my father was dead or alive because he was in forced labor with the Hungarian army somewhere. Those are the circumstances which are extremely stressful for the mother and therefore stressful for the child. And then, as I describe in the first chapter of this book, when I was 11 months old, she gave me to a complete stranger in the street. I stood at that very spot a few months ago in Budapest where she did that. The building is still there. She gave me a total stranger to convey me to some relatives living under somewhat better circumstances. So that was my first year of life.
And then you wound up reunited with your mother, but only after a month or two, I gather. And
about 5 or 6 weeks. Yeah.
And things continued to be difficult. And then there was a second, when you were, I guess, I don't know, 11 or 12 or something, was when you were in Hungary. You had been taught that the Soviets were the good guys in school, and suddenly the Soviets moved into Hungary forcefully, and you had to reassess.
Well, so the Russians, after the Second World War, the Russian occupation persisted, in 56, and they imposed a very brutal Stalinist dictatorship on the country in 1949. And in 56, there was a rebellion against that, the Hungarian Revolution in October 56. And then all of a sudden, the Soviet army that has saved my life, that literally has saved my life, and whose ideology I'd bought into as a child growing up in communist Hungary, when the rebellion happened, within a week they came back in and they crushed it very brutally. And all of a sudden my heroes became villains. So that's the first of a series of disillusionments that I went through on the political scale in my youth.
Okay, now, do I have it right that your view of your trauma, and I know you emphasize that we should think of trauma not as the events that led to the trauma, but think of the trauma as the wound, that you think that you were left not convinced that you're worthy of love or needing to do things to earn the affection or approval of people to an inordinate extent. Is that the basic idea?
Yeah. So when your mother is depressed and stressed and can barely assure your survival, you don't get a sense that you're much fun to be with, And then when you give in to a total stranger in the street, all of a sudden, what message do you get? Of course, it was the greatest act of love my mother could have committed. Imagine a 24-year-old young woman handing a baby to a stranger. Imagine that, It's an incredible act of love, but the infant doesn't experience it that way. For the infant, he's being abandoned. And then I get close to the caregivers who looked after me during those 6 weeks, and then I'm separated from them again. The message I get is that I'm not wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the wound. So trauma, that's what trauma means. Trauma literally means a wound. And so that the wound is not that I was given to a stranger, the wound that I made it mean that I wasn't wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, if you're not wanted, then you find ways of compensating for that. And one way of, and also there's tremendous pain around being abandoned and not being wanted. Then this is when addictions come in. When addictions are always about soothing the pain. And I don't care what you're addicted to, whether it's opiates or work or pornography or eating or gambling or shopping. It's always about soothing pain. So there's a lot of pain. And when the pain breaks through, then you turn to external ways. This is where the Buddhist concept of attachment comes into it, because you get attached to all these external things.
Mm-hmm.
Fill the hole within you, and that hole was created by the trauma. So whether it's addictions or compensating for not being wanted, demanding special attention because you didn't get the attention that you needed, these are all sourced in early childhood experiences.
Okay. Now, a question you've probably encountered on addiction from skeptics is isn't addiction like not that hard to explain? I mean, some drugs are going to make everyone feel better than they felt the moment before.
Yeah,
right?
But these skeptics are just ignorant. The reality is that most people who try most drugs never get addicted. Mm-hmm. So no drug causes addiction. I used to work in palliative care before I worked in addictions, and I gave large quantities of opiates to people in severe pain at the end of life. Now, let's say somebody had severe pain, so they needed opiates, but then we gave them a spinal block, mm-hmm. which eliminated the pain. We can get them off their opiates really, really quickly, and they didn't get addicted. So the drugs themselves, and I gave people levels of opiates that the average drug addict can only dream about, but they didn't get addicted. This is not even controversial. So no drug causes addiction. That's a complete myth. It's a drug in combination with a needy individual where they need soothing for emotional pain. And when I worked in Vancouver's downtown east side, which is North America's most notorious area of drug use, by the way, bar none, in 12 years of work, I had not a single female patient who had not been sexually abused as a child. And in the large-scale studies, as I make clear in this book and my previous work, are not even controversial. The more childhood trauma somebody experiences, exponentially the greater the risk for addiction as an adult. Of course, because as I say in this book, the question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. Addictions are all about escaping pain, and nobody chooses to be in pain. People who are not in emotional pain, when they get opiates, they want to get off them as soon as they can. Mm-hmm. And nobody, nor is it a genetic disease that's just scientific nonsense. I could tell you the science now, but I'm just asserting that nobody's ever found an addiction gene, or when they do, 3 years later, it turned out they found nothing. So addictions are all about pain. That's what it's about.
So in the case of your trauma, do you trace the effects all the way up to your being a very kind of high achieving adult, intent on always doing more work, and in your case, given your chosen profession, helping more people and so on. But I take it you do see consequences lasting that long?
Well, the consequences last until you work them through, and you can go to your death at age 89 and still be stuck in traumatic imprints. In terms of the high achievement in my life, I don't pin it on any one particular dynamic, but there's a number of different contributing streams that flow into it. One of them is my genuine desire to help humanity. Mm-hmm. That's my calling. That's a calling. That's something that calls me. But a calling is not compulsive. I can be called and I can choose to respond or not to respond to the call. Or I can be driven. Now, when I'm driven to do something, I don't have a choice in the matter. I'm driven like a leaf in the wind. And in terms of my workaholism, that wasn't just my desire to help humanity. That was my desire or my need to prove that I'm wanted, that I'm worthwhile, that I have the right to exist, which right was questioned from the moment that I was born.
Mm-hmm.
So that the drivenness is a response to the trauma, the calling is not. So one could be high achieving purely out of drivenness, in which case you end up one of these very successful failures.
Uh-huh.
People who at the top of the ladder who just crash emotionally or psychologically. I could achieve a lot because of my calling that I genuinely honor. But the part that made me a driven workaholic, that made me ignore my children for the sake of my work, that's the trauma part.
Well, do you ever think, well, maybe, on balance, I helped more people than I would have helped if I hadn't been traumatized?
Well, that may be true, but if I had young children again, I'd never make that choice. I would never say, I'm going to sacrifice your kids or your happiness or your well-being or my relationship with you on the altar of helping humanity. I would not do that. I would not choose it. No parent would choose to do that.
Mm-hmm. So let me, if I could be a little self-indulgent and talk about my own tortured psyche, I'd like to do so in a way that might help you expand on the meaning of trauma and why you think it's an important word to use. So when I look back on my own, I mean, one thing about myself that I'm not entirely happy with is the extent to which I worry about what other people think of me. Now, that's a very common human thing. I mean, to some extent, the concern is just built into us. It makes sense, but there's such a thing as too much.
No, it's not. It's not built into us at all.
Okay, well, we disagree about that, but go ahead and elaborate on why you think it isn't. I mean, I think we're social animals designed by natural selection to live in communities and to sustain the esteem of people and so on.
Well, it's true that we're social animals and that our relationships are important to us, but worry is not built into us. Okay, so look, what you just told me is about your childhood,
right? Well, I haven't told you that part yet, but go ahead.
Yes, you did already.
In what way?
Well, this worry that you have about other people see you. When you're a child, your life depends on it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the essential, non-negotiable needs of the human child is to be fully accepted in a warm attachment relationship unconditionally. Not because they're good, compliant, nice, good-looking, successful, cute, any of that, just because they are. The child who gets that unconditional loving attention doesn't go on worrying about what people think of them. They develop the confidence that they're okay just as they are.
Okay.
So the worry part reflects to me, Bob, the certainty in my mind that when you were a child, your parents, no matter how many they may have loved you, were not capable of giving you unconditional loving acceptance because of their own limitations.
Okay. See, here, I have a different theory. I mean, I don't remember my parents that way. Now, that doesn't mean they weren't that way or that they weren't subtly that way. But the part, if I had to conjecturally explain why, I think I worry about what people think of me even more than the average person. It would have to do with the fact that we moved around a lot during my childhood. My father was in the military. We moved around all the time.
You're a military brat. I think
that's right.
Yeah,
it's true. I'm a brat, period, but also a military one. And so I could never take for granted my place in the community. It's like you're always showing up, and in a kind of precarious position, and so you pay a lot of attention to what people think about you, what does and doesn't gain acceptance in this environment.
And how did that feel to you as a child?
Well, I would imagine, I think there was a lot of anxiety associated with it.
Who did you talk to about that anxiety?
Who did I talk to about? I talked to my mother was always ready to listen to my problems. My father was at the office often, as was more common in those days. But
so you did talk to your mother about your anxieties.
I talked about to my father too. I remember, like if I, I remember.
What age? What age?
Well, the conversations I remember were about issues were, I don't know, 11, 12, 13. I mean, at 12, I moved to a radically new environment, an urban environment. And
how about when you were 4 or 5 years old? Did you talk to your parents?
I think so. I mean, look, my mother was really, really a loving person. I mean, and I guess I'm asking, so this is what I noted is you really, really emphasize the parent-child thing. And I know that's a school of thought, John Bowlby, attachment theory, and there's a very substantial body of thought and research about that. But it just makes sense to me. I mean, the kinds of parents that you say would be not so inclined to inflict trauma, the kind who do give unconditional love, they must exist. There must be, right, people who have them. I kind of remember my parents that way, but I guess my question is, wouldn't you also think that humans are, developmentally very responsive to the environment created by their peers as they grow up, enter adolescence? And let me finish the question. The question I was going to ask you is, let's suppose I'm right about this, and that moving around a lot did have this effect. What I was going to say was, I've always kind of conjectured that that's the case. I'm not sure, but I haven't used the word trauma. I've thought of it as almost, in a technical sense, an adaptive response, which doesn't mean it's healthy, doesn't mean it's good, just means that, yeah, I can see why an organism would respond that way. And it's, in a certain sense, a successful way of coping with an uncertain social environment. So I haven't used the word trauma. And I guess I kind of have two questions. If I was right about that, A, would it qualify as trauma in your view? And then B, if so, why would you want to use the word trauma rather than describe it the way I've described it, if that makes sense?
Well, you mentioned the peers. What was your relationship like with your peers?
I usually wound up doing well in my social environment, but I think it took a lot of work and was stressful.
Okay. And you remember talking to your parents about that stress?
I don't remember trying and them not listening. That's for sure. You
don't even remember trying even.
I don't have a great memory. I remember like if I was if there was like a bully or something. I remember talking about that, and they were very, very open and responsive. What
kind of response? What kind of response did you get?
I don't know, just a willingness to. I don't remember exactly. And I didn't. It's not like I got bullied. It's just that you inevitably encounter. It's like you move to an urban environment. It's very different. It's more rough and tumble. I remember talking to them about that.
Can I ask how your parents' relationship was with each other?
Seemed good. Not I don't. I feel very self-indulgent. I like talking about myself, but I don't want to move the spotlight too far away from your book and your work.
No, it's okay. It's okay. You're actually talking about my book here.
Yeah.
I
would say it seemed very good. No one in my family is very demonstrative. I'll say that. We're not huggers. My father had a truly traumatic childhood, right? I mean, his parents, by the time he was 14, both of his parents were dead. 3 of his siblings were dead. Depression era. His father was a sharecropper. Just abject poverty. That may be why but on the other hand, our extended family, they're not huggers. Southern Baptists from West Texas are not huggers, at least in this generation. So there's not a lot of demonstrative, not a lot of physical demonstration of love. That's true. But I just never didn't feel loved.
Yeah, well, very few children don't feel loved.
Yeah.
It's not a question of whether they're loved or not. It's a question of how clearly seen they are, how clearly understood they are, clearly listened to they are, and how clearly accepted they are for exactly the way they are. That's the real question. Missing those factors is wounding to a sensitive child. So trauma doesn't necessarily involve terrible things happening. It's also the absence of the good things that should happen. The children need to be hugged. That's one of their needs.
I'm sure my mother hugged me a lot. My father wasn't. The male hugging is not a big tradition among West Texas Southern Baptists.
Okay. All right. Your parents didn't fight, right?
No, I don't remember. I don't remember much of it. There's naturally tension sometimes, but
and there's no drinking in the family.
Not to speak of. That's another thing about Southern Baptists. I mean, my father drank a little bit, but always in moderation.
Yeah. Okay. And you say you don't have a whole lot of memory for childhood?
Well, I just don't have a great memory. I mean, I have a lot of specific memories from, the salient things that happened, the emotionally salient things you remember.
Okay. So here's what I hear you saying. You've got this, what I think I hear you describe as excessive worry about what other people think of you. Is that correct? And you ascribe that to the constant moving around and having to adjust to new dynamics and new contexts all the time. Okay. Well, that's true. A lot of military kids face that. A lot of them have ADHD, actually. I've seen a lot of military kids with
I kind of have that too.
Yeah. No, ADHD is a stress response. People tune out when they're stressed and there's no help available. That's when people tune out. So it's not a disease that people inherit. That's my first book, by the way, was in ADHD after I was diagnosed in my 50s. And so the tuning out is not a disease. It's a coping mechanism, which functions at the time to protect you from the stress, but then creates problems later on. And so when you mention coping mechanisms, all these early childhood mechanisms, coping mechanisms, are necessary at the time, but then they start to interfere with your capacity to be present and to function. Your excessive worry about what other people think of you, to me, tells me that you did not have the support for those emotions that you needed as a child. Otherwise, you wouldn't be so worried about it. And I'm not blaming your parents, but that's a wound. That's a trauma. And that doesn't make your parents bad people or bad parents. It's just that, see, that's the other thing is, even you're moving around. Here's the thing. How human beings evolved, and I talk about this in the book, we evolved in small band hunter-gatherer groups. That's where we lived for millions of years and hundreds of thousands of years, including our own species. That's how we lived till about 15,000 years ago, all of us, which means that there was a constant presence of known and caring adults around you, way beyond the parents. So it's expression. It takes a village. Well, it takes a tribe. It takes a clan, and so that was constantly being disrupted for you. That's a loss, because your attachments were always being threatened and sometimes lost, and then you had to adjust to a new set of circumstances. Your parents would have to been extraordinarily present and emotionally available and attuned with you for that not to affect you. That's a trauma. It's a wound.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get to that part. I mean, and thank you. I feel guilty. Like I should say, like the check is in the mail. I don't think I should get this much therapy for free. I think whatever your hourly rate is, I'm happy to pay it. But
well, you know what? You're paying it back already because you're letting me promote my book. That's what you're doing.
Okay. Well, I'll let you hold your book up more as a form of payment, I guess. But So the word trauma, I mean, part of my question was, is it important that would it help me? Do you think it helps me to think of that as a wound? Leave aside why it happened.
Look, so I don't care how you language it. If the word trauma denotes for you something too horrible and daunting for you to apply it to your experience, don't. Now, I do talk about the two types of traumatic experiences: the big T trauma with the abuse and the violence and the addictions in the family. Then I talk about the small T traumas, which is not about the terrible things that happened, but about the good things that didn't happen, perhaps. But even given that distinction, if the word trauma is just, it's like the word God or like the word anything. When I say God, you have no idea what I mean by it, and I have no idea what you make it mean in your own mind. And the Southern Baptist idea of God is very different from the Sufi idea of God, from the Jewish idea of God, from the Catholic idea of God, and yet we all use the same word. Well, so words are deceptive sometimes. Then words are sometimes diverting. But I'm saying that extreme anxiety or excessive anxiety about what other people think of you is a loss of confidence in yourself, and it's a loss of acceptance of yourself as you are. You're having to define yourself by what other people think of you. That's a disconnection from yourself. And I'm saying that's a wound. It's the impact of a wound. And as long as it's not healed, it has a unpleasant, to say the least, effect on your life. So whatever you want to call it, it's a dynamic that's worth, from my perspective, addressing and healing. So that's my.
Well, it also inhibits something you stress in the book, or is intention with something you stress in the book, authenticity.
Yeah.
Right. Do you want to talk a little about what you mean by authenticity as a valuable thing?
Yeah. So again, we're talking about the meanings of words, and authenticity comes from the word auto, for self. Like an automobile is a self-propelled, vehicle, as opposed to a horse-drawn carriage. So authenticity is ourselves, and children have this absolute need. It's an essential developmental need, much denied in our society, much suppressed in our society. Children have this need to be able to experience all their emotions, whatever they are, and have those emotions understood and heard and accepted by the parents. That's just a need of the child. Our brains are wired for a whole set of emotions. Our emotions are not arbitrary. They're essential for us to make sense of the world. We have to know what is nourishing and what is not. We have to know what we like and what we don't like. We have to be able to get close to people or to get away from them, as the case may be. Emotions are the dynamics that help us do all that stuff. And so our brains are wired with a whole set of emotions, anger being one of them, grief, fear, love, and so on. These are all emotions wired into our brains. Children who get the message that some aspects of their emotional life is not acceptable to their parents will necessarily suppress it so as to be able to connect with the parents. Because the connection with the parents, what in psychological terms we call the attachment relationship, and you mentioned attachment theory, John Bowlby, and so on. Well, the Buddhist, it's just the opposite of the Buddhist word of, Buddhist attachment.
It is different, yes.
Buddhist attachment is an excessive clinging to something. The attachment in the psychological sense is the belonging to somebody, is the connection with somebody. And actually what happens is, this is what gets interesting, is that if you don't get your attachment needs met as an infant, as a child, you tend to be attached to external things later on as a way of compensating. So the lack of one attachment leads to the other kind of attachment. Now, when the child has to suppress their emotions for the sake of belonging, they lose connection with themselves. They lose their authenticity. And now, for example, I mean, I'm not saying this is true for you, but theoretically, if you're worried about what other people think of you, you might go into a situation, you probably don't do this, but conceivably, a person like that might go into a situation, something is being discussed, and he's got a point of view that's different from what is being voiced by everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And for the sake of being accepted, they'll suppress their own opinion, their own true self in order to be accepted.
Yeah.
And then when that happens, there's a sense of shame and disconnect afterwards, And so authenticity, or some people will try to be very, very nice, so that's to be accepted by others. And so they suppress the healthy anger. So they don't protect themselves, as science has shown. So that the disconnection from our authenticity has significant health impacts on our mental health and our physical health and on our view of ourselves. And at a certain point, it's not unusual for people in their 40s and their 50s to start saying, well, whose life am I leading anyway?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting your point about the two meanings of authenticity, the kind of Bowlby meaning and the Buddhist meaning, because when I first saw in your book that you were pairing attachment and authenticity, you were going to discuss them together. My first thought was what inhibits authenticity can be attachment to esteem in the Buddhist sense, right? And social media really amplifies this, right? Because you have an opinion you want to express on Twitter. If it rubs people the wrong way, there's an avalanche of negative feedback. So it really becomes a vivid thing. But anyway, my point is, I initially was thinking of the one kind of attachment, the kind that the Buddha says should be avoided. You mean attachment in the other sense. At the same time, you wouldn't deny the dynamic I'm describing, I'm sure, as as an issue, right? In other words,
it's an issue. I mean,
yeah.
my own attachment to having people think well of me and to want me led me to behaviors that was not helpful for me or for my family.
Mm-hmm.
So that I totally get the Buddhist concept of attachment. And I say that it's a response to the lack of proper attachments that comes early in life.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned community and how natural our kind of thirst for community is. I mean, we evolved in communities, and you discuss how, in many ways, the modern environment is kind of hostile to our quest for community. Right? Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Well, so there's I quote Noam Chomsky in his book, who says that every society has either an implicit or an explicit view of human nature. Now, what is the view of human nature in capitalist society? The view of human nature is that people are selfish, greedy, aggressive, competitive individualists. That's the view of human nature. As a matter of fact, in common parlance, when somebody does something selfish or greedy or manipulative, what do we say? We say, oh, that's just human nature. Interestingly enough, when somebody does something generous or kind or open-hearted, nobody says, oh, that's just human nature.
Mm-hmm.
Because our view of human nature is this particular competitive against selfish image. Now, that reflects the ideology of capitalism. But is it actually true? Because as we evolved, our needs were for connection, collaboration, community, care, connection. These are actual needs. So the very idea that this society promulgates about human nature goes contrary to human needs. And to the point where people in positions of incredible power are quite willing to destroy the earth for the sake of their own advancement and power and profit. And we think that's normal. That's the norm. So in its very conception of human nature, which is just a reflection of its own needs, this system imposes a view of ourselves on us that ends up hurting us. And I often ask people, if you want to know what your true nature is, I mean, let me ask you, have you ever done something selfish and grasping or manipulative? Ever done anything like that ever in your life?
You might say.
Okay. Well, join the club. Have you also ever done things that are open-hearted and generous and kind?
Yeah.
He says a bit hesitantly, but I'm sure you have. Now, when you do the kind, open-hearted thing. What does your body feel like? When are you more at ease?
Right. That feels great.
Yeah, that's your nature.
Right.
That's why it feels so great, you know, and that, so that the whole conception that we're sold of who we are is a false conception. And then we're supposed to live our life like that. And our schools are designed to promote competition and to elevate the winners and denigrate the losers, to punish the kids who are traumatized and therefore have trouble learning and trouble paying attention and trouble behaving. And our workplaces are like that. And the whole image conscious social media that you've talked about is designed to elevate success and to ridicule failure. That's the culture that we live in. That's why I call it toxic.
Yeah. And you think it's worse than it used to be? I mean, you think it's worse than it was in the recent past?
Well, what I can say is the American Surgeon General, Vice Admiral Vivek Murthy, is about to publish a report on loneliness. Loneliness has become an epidemic in Western societies. In Britain, they've had to appoint a minister for loneliness. And loneliness has been rising documentably in the last 40, 50 years since the rise of Reaganite and Thatcherite neoliberalism and neoliberalist economics. And so there's the real, and in terms of as inequality rises in a society, which is rising rapidly in the society, ill health rises.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the United States last year, I don't know if most people realize this, but in the United States last year, I think something like twice as many people died of overdoses as died in the Vietnam, Afghan, and Iraq war put together. Mm. I'm talking about American deaths now. Mm-hmm. I don't talk about 3 million Vietnamese who died or the 500,000 Iraqis who died. You know, no. And those numbers keep going up. So it is getting worse. More children are committing suicide. More children are being diagnosed with ADHD and depression and anxiety and so-called oppositional defiant disorder and this, that, and the other. Now, either we can assume that the rise in mental health diagnosis is, you know, and the New York Times and the New Yorker both had hand-wringing articles last year about the rise in childhood suicides. What's driving it? My God, they're just not looking at the evidence. You know, what's driving it is the stress on the parenting environment and the lack of support and connection and attachment that our children are receiving when parents are so stressed. And if you look at stress levels, they're much higher than they used to be. So yeah, it's getting worse.
Mm-hmm.
In the midst of all this wealth.
If there was a single policy change you could make that would help, what would that be? Well,
given my, not just mine, given mine, but the research evidence that it all begins early in life, the single most important policy change would be the attention and support that we give to new parents. Mm-hmm. So that they can provide a relatively non-stressed, connected, non-anxious environment to their kids. That'd be the biggest one.
Okay. Well, I want to just touch again briefly on this authenticity idea. So part of authenticity for you, maybe a big part, is kind of being in touch with your feelings, giving valid expression to your feelings. You wouldn't deny, I'm sure, that there's such a thing as a not entirely wholesome expression of a feeling, or feelings that shouldn't be mindlessly followed. And maybe one way to talk about that a little is the word anger. There's a part of the book where you list these 4 or 5 words that begin with A that are important: authenticity, agency, acceptance, and anger is one of them. Anger, a lot of people would not have, if you showed them those 4 words and said, which one of these doesn't belong, right? They'd say, well, anger, that's the bad one. The other one's the good one. You have a more nuanced view on anger, right?
Yeah. So there's healthy anger and unhealthy anger. Okay. So there's 3 ways to deal with it. Now, the Buddha, by the way, if you read his sutras, He didn't say, don't be angry. He said, when the monk is angry, he recognizes that there's anger in me. He didn't say it suppresses it. He also doesn't say that you act it out on somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
This is the monk recognizes that there's anger in him. So healthy anger is a response to a boundary violation. All animals do it. You step into an animal space and they feel threatened. You're going to see it. Don't come near me. You know, it's healthy. It actually saves violence, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's healthy anger. Now, the two unhealthy ways to deal with anger, number one is to repress it. Now, children will do that if their parents give them the message that good little kids don't get angry, and the real message is angry little kids don't get loved. Then the child will suppress that healthy anger, that become nice and compliant and end up with autoimmune disease or cancer. Because the repression of anger is a common dynamic amongst people with chronic illness. I've seen it. It's also documented in the literature. The other unhealthy anger is when you sort of don't deal with your anger on a regular basis, but it's like a pressure cooker, and all of a sudden you blow your top. In fact, that's exactly what we call it, blowing their top, like a volcano. Well, that kind of rage actually is not only unhealthy for others, it's unhealthy for you. Studies show that in the aftermath of a rage episode, your risk of a stroke or a heart attack double for the next 2 hours because your blood pressure goes up, your blood vessels get narrower, your clotting factors increase, and so on. And not to mention the impact. And also, rage, if you ever experienced a rage episode, and believe me, I have, it doesn't dissipate itself when it's done its job. In fact, the more rageful you get, the more circuits are recruited. It's, we talk about epileptic fits. We also talk about fits of rage. Literally, fit, where more and more of the brain circuitry is recruited. So rather than healthy anger, which says, you're in my space, get out, and once it's done, rage magnifies itself. And it's terrible for your heart and your blood pressure and so on. So those are the three. What we're talking about in the 4 A's is healthy anger, which says, you're in my space, get out. That's all.
Okay. So maybe we should spend a little time on the kind of therapeutic side. There's a technique called compassionate inquiry that you've developed. Do you want to talk a little about how that works? This kind of interrogation of yourself, I guess.
Interrogation might not be the word I would use.
Well, not in the common Hollywood sense. No.
Yeah. Self-inquiry.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I think, again, to go back to Buddhism, I think not that Buddhism is the be-all and the end-all of everything. It's just, I know that's, we both looked at Buddhist literature and you studied it, and you probably practice it a lot more than I do, which is minimal to non-existent. But compassion is a big word in Buddhism. And compassion is important because for healing to happen, there needs to be safety. So that if I'm going to inquire into myself, I also have to provide myself with safety. If I was going to help you, I have to provide you with safety. If you don't feel safe, like if I said to you, why did you do that? How likely are you to really inquire? You're going to get defensive. But if I said to you, I wonder why you did that. But I wasn't attacking you or judging you, then you might be open to looking at why you happen to have done this or that or the other. Same with the self. So compassion is essential. The inquiry part is just being curious. So recognizing if I behave in a certain way, but I didn't deliberately do it. I just did it because it was almost automatic. It's really worth asking, well, why did I do that? What was I acting out? What was going on inside me at the time? So compassion inquiry is a therapeutic method that I've helped to develop, and we've taught it. It's online, and it's a participatory 1 year, very intensive, not for the faint-hearted. interactive course. We've had about 3,000 students in 80 countries in the last 3 years, therapists and doctors and people who work with people. But it's also a technique that we teach people to apply to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Some of those questions that come up because my fundamental assumption is that the answers are inside all of us, that the truth is inside all of us. And what keeps us from our own truth is our own traumatic imprints, our defenses, the stories we tell ourselves, the negative self-beliefs that we hold. And we can get to the source of all that, and we get to the truth of it by asking the right questions. So that's the essence of it.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's a part of the book, and I think this may be under compassionate inquiry, but I'm not quite sure, where you encourage people to ask themselves, like, about whether they're having difficulty saying no.
Yeah.
Right. Are you somebody who has trouble saying no?
Not anymore. Believe me, I get all these invitations and requests, and I'm just.
But it was an issue with you?
Oh yeah, it was a big issue. I could have been. Excuse me. No matter how busy I was a doctor, somebody wanted to my patient, or another pregnant woman wanted to come to me for delivery. I'd see that as a badge of honor, and I'd say yes.
Mm-hmm.
Damn the impact on my own stress levels, and damn the impact on my family. So I had great trouble saying no. Or when I became an author and speaker, invitations. Oh, there's somebody who wants me.
Mm-hmm.
Let me catch the first jet plane. So I had great trouble saying no. As a matter of fact, I've written a book called When the Body Says No, and it's about how when people have trouble saying no, the body will say it in the form of physical illness, like autoimmune disease, cancer. And my wife said to me no more than 5 years ago, she said, buddy, you've written a book called When the Body Says No. Now you better write one called When the Wife Says No, because I'm not putting up with this anymore. So yeah, I've had great trouble saying no. I don't anymore.
Okay. Well, yeah, it is hard. And I think a lot of us wrestle with it. So I promised that we would get back to this. I think I promised the psychedelics issue. You are one of the few people, I think, who can say that they have in any sense been overthrown in a coup sponsored by shamans in South America. But that kind of happened to you, right? So you were doing this therapeutic thing with ayahuasca, this well-known psychedelic drug, and then tell the story of what happened.
Well, I do make a distinction. It's not a drug, it's a medicine.
Okay.
And the difference is, I've taken Prozac, for example, for depression.
Mm-hmm.
That's a drug. And I'm not using that in a pejorative sense, but it's a substance meant to change my biology as long as I'm taking it. A medicine is meant to heal. It's not meant for you to keep taking it. It's meant to promote healing. So it's an important distinction. Prozac will help with the symptoms of depression, but it will not address the original trauma that caused the depression in the first place. A medicine will help you work through the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
That's the difference. So, about 12 years now, I've been working with ayahuasca. I was introduced to it and saw its value. And I'm quite well known as a kind of a adept leader of ayahuasca retreats. I'm not a shaman. I don't hand out the medicine. I don't chant. I don't, but I help people prepare for the ceremony. I help them formulate their intentions. I help them understand and integrate their experience afterwards. So what you're referring to in the book is the chapter where I describe my trip to Peru, to the Amazon jungle, where I was going to work with some shamans. The participants were doctors and medical people and health people from around the world. They came to work with the famous Gabor Maté on ayahuasca, and the shamans did one ceremony, and they said, no, you're too full of stress and darkness, and that darkness affects the others. We can't have you in these ceremonies. So they fired me from my own retreat, and my ego didn't like it a bit. But I knew they were right, because I'd just come from a long speaking trip. I was stressed to the max, and rather than dealing with it, I was trying to bowl my way through it again,
Mm-hmm.
And I can kind of do it, but there's an energy there that undermines the process because I haven't taken care of myself. And so they assigned one of them to work with me, and they worked with the others. Everything worked out beautifully, but I was fired from my own retreat.
But that led to something. Yeah. So you spent time. You spent the week or however long it was in more or less in seclusion with, I guess, one or more shaman, but doing the ayahuasca thing yourself.
Yeah.
And this was like a transformative. Well, maybe that's putting it too strongly, but a very helpful experience for you.
Yeah, it was 10 days, and every second night we had a ceremony. So I had 5 private ceremonies with a shaman all to myself, with a translator present. While the other 5 shamans worked with the rest of the group.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a tough skull, like I really have developed a strong mind, which is a response to. The therapist once said to me that if your parents don't know how to hold you, you develop the mind to hold yourself with. So I tend to be very rationalistic and very linear in my thinking, and a tough cookie, and so other people, they meditate. Some of the people, they meditate or go to spiritual retreats or do a psychedelic, and they have big breakthroughs. For me, that's a lot tougher.
Mm-hmm.
But it did finally happen, and I had a huge breakthrough and a very deep experience that really gave me a different sense of myself and the world that I was living in and the world that I had created with my mind. I wouldn't say that it transformed me, because it's not like I came back as an enlightened being, far from it. But it also didn't leave me.
Mm-hmm.
It's a touch point. It's just like it's an opening that I can return to.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very important.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So before we go, I mean, I'm going to give you a chance to say anything else you want about the book. Before we do that, I'd like to be self-indulgent one more time and ask you a question about. So I'm writing a book on cognitive empathy, by which I mean just perspective taking, not like emotional empathy, not feeling people's pain, not even necessarily caring about them, just understanding their perspective. And yeah. I have this view that, like, if there's one kind of skill or tendency you could change that would make the world a much better place, this would be a good candidate. Just understanding how other people view the world. And I'm just wondering how you react to that. Anything at all you would say about the difficulty of doing this, or the value of doing it, or techniques that help, or whatever?
Well, the value is immense. If you look at the political discourse in your country or even mine these days, if you look at any situation in the world where there's conflict, whether it's in Eastern Europe, whether it's in the Middle East, there's such refusal to even entertain, let alone understand or empathize with the other view, the view of the other.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, it's important. Secondly, it's extraordinarily difficult, because, again, to go back to the Buddha, the first sentence in his Dhammapada, his collection of saying, is that everything is thought in the lead. So basically, with our minds, we create a certain worldview. Somebody has a different worldview. Our own view of the world doesn't even let it in. It kind of filters it out, censors it. So even then, we don't even hear what they're saying, let alone understand it, let alone empathize with it. So it's very, very difficult. And we get attached to our point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And like, if you're attached to your patriotism, for example, well, that can be a positive thing if you love your country and if you're really willing to protect it. That's a good thing. But often that's not how it shows up. It shows up as a kind of an unquestioning acceptance of whatever's done in the name of your country.
Mm-hmm.
There's been so much evil perpetrated in the world by your country, by mine, by Russia, by England, by any country, in the name of patriotism, because people are so attached and they can't let go of it. Attached means that their own self-concept depends on identifying with this larger entity. As soon as we identify, the word identify means, again, it comes from Latin, word idem means the same and facere to make. When I make myself the same as my country, I won't even question my country.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll put up with the worst kind of crimes committed. I mean, I've just received a book, arrived yesterday. It's called Many Holocausts. And it's about the cost of the American Empire
Mm-hmm.
to the world, including with the indigenous population, the genocide that happened here, the slavery, the foreign wars. You know, I mean, I don't mean to get more political here than necessary, but, you know, we, at the Australia Open right now, the tennis tournament that's going on right now, you can't show Russian flags. So
Yeah.
when the Russian players are playing, they can't show the Russian flag. It's okay to show the American flag. Now, the Russians have killed a lot of Ukrainians. It's a war crime.
Yeah.
The Americans killed 500,000 Iraqis. But everybody can carry American flags. And Australia participated in that invasion of Iraq. You can carry Australian flag. Now, this is just blindness.
And the Iraq War was an illegal war, as the invasion of Ukraine was. It was a violation of international law. And, you know, at Wimbledon, they didn't let Daniel, I think his name is Medvedev, play.
Yeah.
And I think he had come out against the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, it's just.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm talking. So this is what I'm talking about. There's this kind of, we could talk a lot about these wars, and you know, I mean, one could ask legitimately, I think, who has the right to feel more threatened? The Russians by the Western military buildup in Ukraine, or the Americans by whatever is happening a billion miles away in Iraq? You know, I mean, it's just ridiculous. I'm not making political comments here on the wars. All I'm saying is the double standard.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a result of identifying with one's country, and whatever we do is okay, whatever they do is not okay.
And of not understanding how they would look at what you're doing, not exercising the cognitive empathy.
Not even asking how they would look at. And I've seen this in Eastern Europe, I've seen this in the Middle East, everywhere. So what you're talking about, I think you call it cognitive empathy, did you?
Mm-hmm.
That capacity, the willingness, the openness to look at the other person's point of view, to receive it, to understand it, and then to consider your own position.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's lacking. It's very important, and it's so difficult. And the difficulty is both based on traumatic imprints as children, because we get very defensive, and also because of the cultural imprints. So, yes, it's both difficult and essential.
Okay. Now, anything else you want to say about your book? Any major things you think we've missed?
You know, it's a very, if I can be self-serving, it's a very rich book. It covers so many different topics. It shows the unity of all these topics. So it's not randomly meandering, but I talk about pregnancy and childbirth and parenting and childhood trauma, and I talk about economics and politics and spirituality and psychology and health and illness, physical and mental, and addictions,
epigenetics,
and how all this is part of one universal process. It's all one, and we can't understand any of it in isolation from the others. So that's the essence of the book. The response to it has been more than gratifying. It's going to be published so far in 28 other languages. It's this week, it's 11th, and next week it'll be its 12th week on New York Times bestsellers list. In Canada, it's been the number 1 or 2 best-selling nonfiction book. I was displaced. My son Daniel and I, we co-wrote it. We were displaced this week by Harry, you know, the Prince Harry. Everybody's wild about Harry these days, as the old song used to go.
Yeah, well, he's paid a heavy price to be in that position.
And that book is also about trauma, by the way.
Yeah.
So in Hungary, which is my birth country, it's been the number 1 nonfiction book since its publication in September. So the response has been really gratifying. And I think what it shows is that people really feel the wounds and the pains and the dysfunctions, and they're looking to understand them, and they're looking for a way out. So this is why I think the book has achieved a success. I just hope it'll continue to go, because I wrote this. It was a hard job, 10 years I had my own panic, my own difficulties writing it. At some point, I found my blood pressure was going up because I was over-identified with it. So it wasn't just a process, it was like me. So if the book wasn't going well, then what about me? You know, I had to let go of that one.
Yeah.
But it was tough. And so I hope people read it. That's the only thing I want to say about it.
Yeah. Well, I encourage that. And I promised that in exchange for the 15 minutes of free therapy you gave me, I'd let you hold it up again. So if you want to hold it up again, that's better than me sending you a check.
Okay, well, sure. Thank you. So this is what
there it is. The Myth is Normal. It is a very attractive cover. And
yeah, I love the cover. Yeah, it like almost says, read me, you know?
Yeah, it's demanding that you read it. And the subtitle is Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture.
That's correct.
So thank you so much, Gabor. Great talking to you, and continue. Good luck with it.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to speak with you, and thank you for giving me this platform.